That's what companies should be doing. But what do companies actually do in the real world? Well, first of all, obviously not-for-profit corporations aren't very interested in maximizing profit for the most part. And they're a relatively modest but a growing sector of the economy. Even if they don't maximize profit, though, many not-for-profit corporations are interested in making sure they're still making money back. So for example, if you look at the Grameen Bank, which is a micro-lender that lends to poor people in developing countries, they do care quite a bit about getting their money back because they want to be able to make more loans. And that can lead them to act in a way that's more profit maximizing than you might think, given that they were a not-for-profit. Cooperatives take, to some extent, into account consumer and worker interests, but the managers of those corporations need to actually get money in order to pay themselves. And if they're interested in paying themselves more than they're interested in serving the consumer's interest, they may actually act more like a profit maximizer than they would if they were, serving the interests of their workers and consumers. State-owned companies are sort of legendarily inefficient, bureaucratic, politically driven, make lots of losses, and so you would think that they don't really maximize profits, and I think that's often the case, but it really depends on who's put in charge of managing them. So if you look at the big bailouts that the US government did, where it sort of nationalized banks and the car companies, it actually put in charge managers who really wanted to pay back the government rather than serve a bunch of political goals, because it was so politically dangerous not to have the government pay back, because it was a big political issue. So in that case, they actually did a pretty good job maximizing profits. But it's not always the case that state-owned companies don't maximize profits. Depends. So also, firms may have other goals like corporate social responsibility, as we talked about before, but the biggest reason why firms end up not maximizing profits is that managers don't always loyally serve the interests of their shareholders. And this is going to be the primary focus that we're going to talk about, but one important thing to keep in mind is that even in all the things that we're going to focus on for much of the rest of the lecture, when managers don't serve the interests of their shareholders, it's still the case that if managers want to have money to waste or to do something with, they have to earn that money first, right? And so with regards to a lot of the problems we're going to think about, like how much the firm charges for its product or what types of products it chooses to sell, firms will act a lot more like a profit maximizer than you might initially think. Because they want the money, maybe not to give to the shareholders, but for some purpose of their own. Okay, so the principal agent problem, which is the problem between the people who own the company and the people who manage the company, shows up all over economics. And a simple example of it is the relationship between you and your parents now that you're off at college. So your parents probably want you to learn a lot, to achieve career success, etc. And you probably want to do some of that too, but you probably also might want to party a bit. And so what they may want to do is give you some amount of incentive to do better in school, either by screaming at you if you don't do well in school, by paying you for the grades you get, or whatever, right? And as a result, you may want to hide information about the grades that you get if they're not so good, right? They also might want you to study a different subject than you want to study, right? They might say, why don't you become an engineer, or why don't you do economics rather than studying literature or psychology or whatever, right? And so what you might do is you might lie to them and say, look, I tried to do all those things, I just couldn't do it. I was doing really badly in those classes. When in reality, you might have been doing perfectly fine, but you didn't try because you wanted to do something else. Maybe they want you to go to professional school. They want you to become a doctor or a lawyer or a business person, and you'd rather go to graduate school, right? And so you might lie to them about what the course prepares you for, make it look like you're taking courses that will be good to get you into medical school, but will actually be getting you into a biology PhD or something like that, right? So the problem they face is how can they relate to you in a way that encourages you to serve their interests? They have a basic conflict, which is you obviously know what's going on at school a lot better than they do, right? And so they can't just like tell you what you should be doing. But on the other hand, they also don't want you to just do whatever you want, because that's not going to be in their interests very well either. And so this is a crucial problem for companies. When someone gives their money to a manager to go and start a company, they face exactly this type of a problem. The manager knows more about what's going on in the company, but they don't necessarily serve the interests of the owner. So, and it's not just the manager that's hired by the owner. The managers themselves hire managers. And those managers have their own interests in mind, and not the interests of the manager in mind. And those managers hire managers who have their own interests in mind, and not the interests of their managers in mind. And eventually you get down to the low-level worker, who again has his own interests in mind, rather than the interests of the company in mind. So this is what I say is sort of turtles all the way down. I don't know if anyone knows that story, but the idea is there's this whole hierarchy of people, each of whom is self-interested rather than looking out for the interest of the company. So it's actually kind of amazing, not how badly companies work, but how well they manage to work, given how many layers of conflict there are within most companies. So the ideal situation from this perspective would be that the person who manages the company is the same person who owns it. Chanel, hey, why would that be the ideal situation?
Well, because if the manager, basically, if you're making it so simplified that it's just like a manager owns its own thing, then he's only responsible for himself and the, I guess, company. Yeah. And that if he wants to do things on his own, it's also doing things for the company. So it's the same interest.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So basically, he doesn't have any conflict. There's no principal agent problem. If it was your parents who were at school, right, then they would always do what was in their own interest. So the problem is that this is usually not really practical, because there are many people who are very talented who might be good people to start businesses, but who don't have any money currently, right? And so some people are talented business starters, some people are rich. And unless those are exactly the same people, it's going to be really important to be able to have some way that the rich people can give their money to the talented people to start the business, right? And there is a way that even if the person didn't have the money, we could still, make him really worry about doing what's in the interests of the owner. We could do what's called make him the residual claimant. So residual claimant is someone who takes on all the costs of what the company experiences. But to do that with someone who has very little money, we can't do it by just finding him money if he doesn't perform. We'd have to do something like throw him in jail or torture him, if he didn't do a good job. And I think most of us would be hesitant to enter into that type of a relationship with a company that we were trying to start, because we would be too afraid that there would just be some risk out there that we had no control over that would lead the company to do bad, and we'd end up, in a terrible situation, right? So the problem is that in countries where there aren't good solutions to this principal agent problem, where there aren't good protection of the shareholders against the managers, basically the only thing you can do is run the company yourself or get someone in your family to run the company who you know will look after your interests. And that's a primary reason why in developing countries there's so much nepotism and so many family-run companies. And that's a big source of inequality. And a lot of people are really opposed to nepotism. But if you think about it, it's not necessarily a bad thing given what's going on, because it's the only way that you can trust that you're going to get your money back if there's no legal protections. But on the other hand, it's really bad from society's perspective that we don't have some other method of doing this, And it's a major source of perpetuating inequality that there's no way for someone who's talented to get money to start a company because there aren't legal protections. So that's exactly the reason why economists believe in protecting the shareholders' interests, even if they don't necessarily sympathize with the shareholders, because it helps actually reduce inequality by helping talented but poor people get money to start companies. This problem of incentives, the principal agent problem, is a very general problem of economics, and we're going to be coming back to it a lot throughout the course. So I'm just going to give a brief and pretty informal introduction to some of these issues. Okay, so if you think about what you would learn when you did an MBA, what is the essence of management? It's basically trying to find ways to give incentives to your workers to actually do a good job. And there's lots of different ways of doing that. So, where's Prashant? Yeah, hey Prashant, what are some examples of incentives or ways that companies get their workers to do a good job?
In their salary package, it could include like stock options, or like provide them like part of the company.
Yeah.
They can also provide them like an increased compensation based on like the amount of output they have.
Yeah.
So like if they do well, then they're rewarded for that for the wealth and work. And then you have like some other sort of I guess work balance thing in which you incentivize them to take care of their like professional life, so it translates into personal life. It translates into doing well in the professional life.
Yeah, so those are all very good examples. So I'm going to sort of go down a list, which is going to start with the things that economists usually focus on, which are very hard, money-based type things, and then go to other things which I think are just as important for encouraging people to do a good job, but which aren't quite so hard in some sense. So equity, stock options. Stock options is the right to buy a company at a certain price, are ways of making if you give those to a manager, he'll care more about how the firm does. Another thing you can do is, which was sort of similar to what Vrishant was saying as well, is you can have compensation rather than being given directly to someone. You can put it into a pot and say the person can only get that if the company is still around in 5 years and it doesn't go bust, or if the company does better in future years. So that's called contingent, deferred, or vesting compensation. And one example of that is making the managers of the company personally liable for things that go wrong at the company. Clawbacks are another example, which is when you give the money to the person, but if something goes wrong, the investors have the right to come back and take the money back from them. Another thing you can do is you can just directly monitor people. And in fact, at a lot of low-level jobs, that's exactly what a manager does. His job is to make sure that the people aren't slacking off. And if they're slacking off, he screams at them and he threatens to fire them and so forth, right? Another thing that is used sometimes is audits or lawsuits. So a company can be audited periodically to make sure they're not doing funny business, right? And then if they are, a lawsuit can be brought against them by their shareholders. And that's actually become increasingly popular, bringing lawsuits against managers for not doing what's in the interest of their shareholders. Another thing that is often used is you can use the fear of losing a job. So if people are really afraid of losing their job, right, then they'll be really careful to do their job well because they know that there's this threat of them being fired. And so you might actually pay someone more than it's worth to have them just to make sure, or more than the least that you could pay them, just to make sure that they really value their job and are afraid to lose it, right? That's called an efficiency wage. You can also pay people bonuses. So based either on some specific performance, as Vrishant was suggesting, but also your boss just evaluates did you do a good or a bad job this year and pays you a bonus if he thinks she thinks you did a good job. Then there are also softer things, like you could care about your reputation. So you want to do a good job because you're afraid that if you don't get a good job, you'll get a reputation for being lazy, and then no one will want to hire you in the future. Right? Um,